Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime.
Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. Just click donate. It helps keep this show going. Okay, on with the show.
I'm not a fan of skyscrapers. When I was in Toronto in 2024, I kept my eyes fixed on the ground. I stayed at the Sheraton, and really the first thing I did when I got to my room on the 28th floor was close my curtains. I did my best to ignore the feeling that the entire structure was just swaying with me inside. The idea of being in any building taller than 10 stories, in all honesty, kind of fills me with dread. So no, you will not catch me doing the CN Tower's edge walk. Also, there's no way I could be in one under construction. The wind blowing through the open walls, birds flying around me, the sound of beams and girders creaking as they settle into their new home. Honestly, I'm freaking out just thinking about it. But some aren't bothered by heights. They live for the thrill of walking on steel beams far above the sidewalks, and their boot prints are found on some of the most famous structures on the continent. The Golden Gate Bridge, the CN Tower, and almost the entire skyline in Manhattan, which they helped to build. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today I'm doing my best not to look down as I share the story of steel and construction workers who have shaped our cities. These are the Mohawk Skywalkers. Centuries before Europeans landed on what became Canadian shores, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was one of the most powerful indigenous alliances in North America. According to the oral history, the Confederacy was established after a solar eclipse on August 31st, 1142 CE, and was born out of warfare between the 5 nations who were part of it. For generations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Onondaga fought constantly around the Great Lakes region. Untold hundreds, even thousands were killed. It couldn't go on forever. One day, a man calling himself Hiawatha told the nation there was another way. He traveled through the region and gathered the leaders and told them that if they did not stop warring, the only thing they would achieve would be the death of their people. Hiawatha instructed them in the great law given to him by the great peacemaker. He said that if the 5 nations united, they would be far stronger than they could ever be alone. He succeeded, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was born.
This tree represents our people.
What kind of tree is it, Duda?
A tree of great peace. The peacemaker gave the great laws of peace to the Iroquois in the dark times many years ago. Hiawatha spoke for the peacemaker.
You chiefs have brought ruin and despair to your children through war. We must fling this burning demon into the underground river to be carried away forever. Peace now. Peace. And the power of the great peace drove the evil from them.
Does the Great Peace still have power?
You're here, aren't you?
Now, by the time the French arrived in the 17th century to settle in the St. Lawrence area, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a superpower. The French became a hated enemy. From 1609 until nearly the end of the century, the two fought against each other in what was called the Beaver Wars. By the 1660s, French Jesuit missionaries had relocated converts to New France, and by 1680, 163 square kilometers was granted by the French crown to the Mohawk near Montreal. This was the beginning of the Kahnawake Reserve. For the next 200 years, the reserve grew in population but decreased in territory size. Whenever European settlers needed land, they simply carved it from the reserve without consultation, and today it's a quarter of that original size. And as for the Mohawk, they saw their land being taken from them, so they looked for ways to prosper in this changing world. It was the late 19th century, and railroads were being constructed across Quebec. This meant steel bridges were popping up pretty much yearly to facilitate train travel across rivers. Older bridges were renovated to handle the weight of modern locomotives, including the famous Victoria Bridge in Montreal. First opened in 1859, the bridge was one of the longest in the world at 3 kilometers, and by the 1890s, increased traffic required the single-track metal tube to be replaced, with metal trusses and 2 new tracks. Kahnawake Mohawk delivered stone from a quarry at their reserve to the construction site and soon became intrigued by the steel construction. Wanting to learn more about it, they effortlessly climbed up the bridge's steel girders to get a closer look. Supervisors were immediately impressed by their lack of fear and they were hired on the spot. One supervisor said, "They were as agile as goats, immune to the noise of riveting, which usually makes newcomers to construction sick and dizzy." It was the birth of the Mohawk Steelwalkers. Conway Jocks, a Mohawk Skywalker, said, "We had a reputation as rivermen, and ironworking was a different kind of work. We didn't have the tools or traditional skills to fall back on. It was our introduction to the industrial age. As fathers worked on bridges, sons tried to emulate them, and by 12 years old, those sons were assisting their fathers, and they in turn taught their own sons. And soon, there was a generation of Mohawk iron workers throughout Quebec. They were the best at what they did and would come and go as they pleased. This was a marked difference from other indigenous people on the land, because at the time their movements were controlled by Indian agents who decided who could and could not leave the reserve. Meanwhile, for decades, Mohawk steelworkers helped build bridges across the continent. But their next project would bring about very dark days. At the time, the only way to travel across the St. Lawrence River from the North Shore at Quebec City was to take a ferry or use a wintertime ice bridge. So construction of a bridge over the St. Lawrence was considered really as early as 1852, but kept being pushed. It went on and on this way for years until 1903, when the federal government finally issued a $6 million bond. And with that, the newly named Quebec Bridge and Railway Company got down to work. At the time, about 70 Mohawk worked as ironworkers in Quebec, and half were hired to work on this new bridge. With them on board, progress was pretty quick. Little did they know that those above their pay grade were cutting corners. By 1904, the southern portion of the bridge was starting to take shape, and although preliminary calculations had been made in the planning stage, they never checked when the design was complete. The Mohawk steelworkers had really no idea that the weight of the bridge far exceeded carrying capacity. Disaster was looming, and it would arrive on August 29th, 1907. At around 4 p.m., Alexander Bouvet, a leader of a Kahnawake riveting gang, reported that 2 rivets had broken off near a splice and ribs were bending. The boss simply told him it was nothing serious. Bouvet walked back onto the bridge just as the south arm and central section of the bridge disappeared into the St. Lawrence. He held on to one of the bridge's cords, but 75 other men vanished in 15 seconds. Bouvet suffered a broken foot and broken nose, and he was one of the lucky ones. 33 Mohawk workers lost their lives. One family lost 4 brothers, an uncle, a brother-in-law, and a cousin. The disaster left 25 widows and 53 children without fathers at the Kahnawake Reserve. The youngest Mohawk victim was 18. The oldest was 44. His name was Sosa Ori, and he left behind 11 children, with a 12th on the way. The Quebec Bridge collapse killed 3 times the number of Kahnawake men that died in the First and Second World Wars and the Korean War. The Toronto Star wrote of the victims' families. Their quiet, intense grief was most touching and brought tears to the eyes of onlookers even more than it had ever been voiced. The poor things simply sat quiet in the office, hardly uttering a word, but the mere look of their faces was enough to cause strong ones to lower their voices to whispers. Only 8 Mohawk bodies were ever recovered, and the Mohawk of the Kahnawake called that dark day Soon Do Squanay, when the bridge fell. The Mohawk Skywalkers rebounded from this tragedy, but before they returned to work, they promised to never work in family groups to safeguard the women and the reserve from future disaster. And as the years went on, generational skills continued to be passed down until they helped shape the very skylines of some of the most important cities in North America. By the early 1920s, New York City had surpassed London as the biggest city in the world with a population approaching 10 million. Space on Manhattan Island was at a premium, so the only option was up. On September 19, 1928, builders broke ground on what would become one of the most famous buildings in the world, the Chrysler Building. It would shape the New York skyline and become an iconic skyscraper. And to achieve this manpower with nerves of steel was needed. And at the time, buildings were built by hand of 4 men in riveting gangs. All skyscrapers first started with a frame made up of steel columns, beams, and girders. A riveting gang would fasten them together. First, a heater would fire up and heat up the rivets in a small forge. Then he would toss them to the sticker-in, who caught them with a glove or metal can and placed them in a hole in either girder or beam. Then the bucker-up braced the rivet using a dolly bar, while the riveter used a pneumonic hammer to mushroom the rivet stem and secure the steel frame. They did this without safety equipment, hundreds of feet in the air. Only their respect for the danger kept them from making unfortunate mistakes. And when you're performing a red-hot rivet ballet far above the sidewalk, you want the best people on the job. Enter the Mohawk Skywalkers. By the 1920s, the Mohawk skill set had become legendary and had spread outside of Quebec to New York City. The first Mohawk worker arrived in about 1916 to work on the Hell Gate Bridge. Since then, nearly every major construction project in New York City would have men from the Kahnawake Reserve on their payroll. As the Great Depression began, jobs were at a premium, so Mohawk workers were more than happy to take on new and more challenging projects in the world's largest city. Now, these workers built the Chrysler Building floor by floor, taking turns of the various positions of the riveting gang. They balanced on narrow beams as birds flew around them with no safety lines or helmets. It was dangerous and hard work, but they enjoyed it, and they were proud to be part of something historic. In August 1930, the Chrysler Building was complete and became the world's tallest building as it reshaped the city's skyline. But that beautiful building didn't hold the title for very long. Less than a mile away, another group of Mohawk Skywalkers were working on a skyscraper that would soon overshadow it, the Empire State Building. In the years before breaking ground on the Empire State Building in 1930, Mohawk ironworkers made the long drive to New York City every Sunday night and returned home on Fridays to spend the weekends with their families in Canada. They were in the unique situation of being allowed to work in the United States without needing proper work documentation, and it was all thanks to a treaty signed 150 years ago. The Jay Treaty of 1794 was signed between the United States and Britain to solve many of the leftover issues of the Treaty of Paris signed 9 years earlier to end the American Revolutionary War. Now, within that treaty, Article 3 of the treaty states that there's free passage of the First Nations across the border without restriction. And in 1925, Mohawk ironworker Paul Diablo was arrested in Philadelphia for illegal immigration. He had crossed the border without proper documentation to work. 2 years later, in a landmark decision, a judge threw out the charge in the case and ruled that the Mohawk were legally allowed to cross the border because it went through their traditional territory. The decision allowed more Mohawk to travel to the United States to become ironworkers. And so, every Sunday, they traveled to New York City and lived in a small Brooklyn neighborhood called North Gowanus. As the neighborhood's Mohawk population increased, it became known as downtown Kahnawake, and catered to the new arrivals by ensuring Canadian products were in stock at the various stores. One business had a sign above the door that said, "The greatest ironworkers in the world pass through these doors." As new Mohawk arrived in the city to work, elders taught them the tricks of the trade to do their job well, but more importantly, safely. Soon every skyscraper in the city had at least one Mohawk crew on it, including the Empire State Building. So construction began on March 17, 1930, and things progressed quickly. Over 10,000 tons of steel erected per month. The last piece of steel in the Empire State Building was placed at the top by a Mohawk worker on September 15th, 1930. If you're not good with quick math, that means the whole building was completed in only 25 weeks. It would, however, take almost a year before the building opened to the public on May 1st, 1931, and officially became the tallest skyscraper in the world. And it held that record for the next 40 years, until it was surpassed by another building that also had Mohawk Skywalkers among its crews. Before I tell you about the building, let's talk about a stereotype that really plagued the Mohawk ironworkers. It was said they had no fear of heights, and that's why they could easily work in the air without a problem. But that's not true. Kyle Bouvet, a Mohawk worker, said, "We have as much fear as the next guy. The difference is we deal with it better." As buildings crept up higher and higher, Mohawk steelworkers continued to outshine those around them while dealing with that fear of heights. And that's because the job became generational. On construction sites, mentors were often fathers. Turin Klaus Jr. said, "My father once told me, son, I don't have a lot of money or a house to leave you when I pass on. The only thing I can do is show you an honest way to make a living. So he took me to my first job as an iron worker. It was exciting and a little scary at the time, and I still haven't found anything better." But despite their incredible skills, they were actually paid lower wages than their white colleagues and were restricted from entering many labor unions. Despite the racism they experienced, the number of Mohawk increased, and by the 1950s, there were 700 Mohawk families living in Brooklyn. While the men worked on skyscrapers, their wives helped build Little Kahnawake into a thriving community. They operating boarded houses for new arrivals from Quebec and also worked in nearby factories. They turned this tiny Mohawk enclave into a thriving neighborhood. By the 1960s, the sons of the men who worked on the Empire State Building had heard of their father's hands in creating the world's tallest building. But two new buildings had been announced that would cast a shadow on the Empire State Building. The North Tower would be 110 floors and stand 1,378 feet in the air with an antenna that topped the building, adding 264 feet. The South Tower would be 110 floors and 1,368 feet tall. This would be called the World Trade Center, and Mohawk workers in New York City would help build them. Their expertise once again helped complete the building that would become the tallest in the world at a brisk pace. From 1968 to 1972, Joe Norton was one of the many on the Mohawk crews. He worked from the 80th to the 101st floors and only stopped because that far up in the sky, the wind was simply too cold. At times, Mohawk Skywalkers stood on steel girders hundreds of meters in the air and looked out towards the Empire State Building and Chrysler Building and thought about how they were shaping the skyline, just like their fathers and uncles had done. 25 years later, when the World Trade Center towers were destroyed on September 11, 2001, their sons and nephews returned to New York City to help rescue survivors and remove the wreckage that became Ground Zero. Today, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum has an exhibit of the Mohawk Skywalkers titled Skywalkers, a portrait of Mohawk ironworkers at the World Trade Center. After the World Trade Center and the iconic Twin Towers were completed and opened to the public on April 4, 1973, Mohawk workers began to form their own construction companies. They took on various jobs across the continent, but technology was making the riveting gangs obsolete. Many of the Mohawk workers left their Brooklyn neighborhood during the late 70s and through the 1980s, and slowly the number of Mohawk Skywalkers dwindled. But they aren't gone. During the mid-part of the 20th century, 15% of the ironworkers in New York City were Mohawk. Today they make up about 10%. Many still make that 7-hour journey from their homes in Canada to work, and now the Kahnawake men are joined by women as they scale North America's tallest structures. When ground broke on One World Trade Center in April 2006, Mohawk Skywalkers were there. Over 200 Mohawk, many of whom dismantled the wreckage of the towers, were on the site to build One World Trade Center. One World Trade Center was rebuilt at the World Trade Center complex in Lower Manhattan and is still the tallest building in the United States, the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, and the 7th tallest in the world. Peter Jacobs' father and grandfather both built skyscrapers in New York City, and he was a connector on One World Trade Center. He said in 2011, "I can tell my grandkids that I helped build this. It would be the highlight of my 30-year career as an iron worker. Knowing the height of the building and what it means to the people who lost their loved ones, it's like a victory for us and the people. John McGowan's great-grandfather and grandfather and father all worked as ironworkers. His father and grandfather both worked on the original World Trade Center, and when the towers collapsed, he was there to help with the cleanup. Then he started working on One World Trade Center, and when it was capped off in 2013, Joe McGowan was there to help mark the momentous occasion. Throughout this episode, I've spent a lot of time talking about New York City, which is unusual for me, but I did it because Mohawk Skywalkers built many of the most famous structures in North America, and New York City reigned skyscraper supreme from the 1920s to the 1970s. There are plenty more across the continent as developers tried to outdo each other, building higher and higher. Mohawk workers made them all possible. When the Sears Tower became the world's tallest building in 1973, men from the Kahnawake Reserve were there. They were there in San Francisco for the Golden Gate Bridge, the TELUS Tower in Montreal, and Hotel Vancouver. Even the United Nations building has Mohawk ironworkers' fingerprints on it. They were also on hand from 1973 to 1975, building possibly the most famous structure in Canadian history, the CN Tower. If there's a construction project in North America, you can bet there are Mohawk steelworkers on the job. The next time you see the skyline of New York City, look at a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge or drive one of Quebec's many bridges. Think about the many Mohawk who helped bring those construction projects to fruition, because the work continues to be dangerous, and it does claim lives. Kenneth McCumber was an ironworker. His grandfather and great-grandfather had also been ironworkers. He started in the family trade when he was 17 and quickly moved up the ranks over the next 4 years. In the spring of 2001, he returned to Canada after working on a 41-story building in Times Square. On June 27th, he was working on a crane on the Champlain Bridge in Montreal. He had finished his shift and was called back, and so he was on a construction platform when it collapsed. At around 3:30 a.m., 2 workers plunged 30 meters into the St. Lawrence River. The 2 men had been standing on a wooden platform on the deck of the bridge when a 20-ton crane toppled. It fell off the bridge, taking the platform and the men with it into the river. One of the workers was rescued. Kenneth McCumber was not. He was found 3 days later. McCumber was buried with 4 feathers, a turtle pin, and a flag alongside other fellow ironworkers next to Longhouse 207 in Kahnawake. The river had claimed another Kahnawake ironworker, just like it did on that dark day in 1903. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the Mohawk Steelworkers. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories, and there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com, or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.